Hi, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame, and welcome to the Candid Frame YouTube channel. Well, today I wanted to talk about photographing strangers. As you may or may not know, I just recently wrote an ebook about my personal approach to photographing strangers. And it's something I'm often asked about. I've been doing street photography for as long as I've been using a camera, and some people, are always wondering, well, how do I do it? They have a desire to, photograph strangers, people they don't know, but are really intimidated by the idea of possible rejection or someone actually getting very angry or violent about it. And the reality of it is that most people are really agreeable to being photographed. I mean, the worst thing that usually happens to me is people say no. So this week, I thought I'd just show you some images, some recent, some old, and just talk about the story behind the photographs. Interestingly enough, for the last several months, I've been kind of in traction, so I've not been able to go out and photograph for several months. So a couple of weekends ago, I just went out with a friend of mine to downtown Los Angeles and just started getting my feet wet again. And surprisingly enough, it was the beginning of that day was incredibly frustrating because I got more no's than I usually get. 8 to 9 times out of 10, when I ask someone if I can photograph them, I get to make the photograph. But I think that morning I must have had like 7 or 8 people say no to me, and I was completely dejected because I felt I was completely out of my game as a result. But eventually, I was able to get some people to say yes. And once I got those initial photographs, I really got back into a groove, and it ended up being a pleasant day. Here's one of the first photographs that I ended up making that morning. I was walking near downtown Los Angeles, where across the street, I spotted these guys exercising. There's this gym here, and there were a pair of guys doing this really heavy weightlifting. And as soon as I saw them, I ran across the street. And then, of course, I waited until he had done one of his presses. But then I asked him, if it would be okay if I made some photographs of him. And, he really agreed to it. He didn't have any problem. And I was really pleased. So at that point, it was just trying to make as good a photograph as possible. And I knew that part of it was for me to get down really low and to make him appear larger than life. And so I did so. So I was pretty much almost down on the sidewalk itself, and then I just waited as he finally prepped to lift these weights. I don't know exactly how much it is. It may be something over 250 kilos. I don't know what that is in pounds, or I just know it's heavy. It's heavier than me, for God's sake. And I'm no lightweight, but this guy was really concentrating and exerting himself, so he wasn't really preoccupied with me pointing the camera at him. One of the things that's important to realize is that when someone says yes to being photographed, at that point you're in control, and you need to take advantage of it. And by that I mean you need to slow down and really take careful consideration of everything, including the subject. And in this case, I was really paying attention to everything, not only with respect to him, but everything in the background. They have this little box here that is Mean Streets, which I guess is the name of the gym. And then I had this figure in the background, and I just knew that I wanted to include them in the frame. So as well as just timing my shot so that I got them at a very sort of peak moment, I had to be aware about these elements in the shot. There are some figures further in the background, but the light wasn't hitting them, so they're largely severely underexposed. And the way I ended up rendering the image in Lightroom and Nick Silver FX Pro really helped to just bring attention to his face and expression and the strain of his body language and the tension of his muscles. I think it was a good shot, and it was also just a good shot for me to walk away from and feel really confident about about starting my day. We ended up going to Alvera Street, and there's a church, St. Viviana's, which is just across the street from Alvera Street. And it just so happened that day they were doing First Communions. So there was a large crowd of families there with children and, people dressed in their finery. And I saw this guy in this seersucker suit. And immediately I saw him and I knew I wanted to photograph him. So what I usually do when I see someone that I want to photograph, I usually find something to compliment them on. In this case, it was a suit. So I just went up to this guy and I just said he looked really fantastic in the suit. And I was really sincere and enthusiastic in my expression of that to them. And then he reacted pretty favorably, to the compliment. And I find that it's often a compliment that allows me entry into the possibility of making an image of someone. So I talked to him a bit about the suit, and then I said, hey, can I photograph you? And even before I had asked him, I'd already considered the lighting and the background, because I'm always sort of trying to make the assumption that the person is going to say yes. And so I'm always thinking about, well, where can I place this subject where the light is good and the background is good? And thankfully, the light in this courtyard and this wall here provided a great backdrop for me. I do have a large photograph of him from head to shoulder, but I really didn't like it as much as this really tight shot where the suit is less emphasized and it's more about his face and those cool sunglasses and the goatee. And for me, this shot, it was much more interesting. Increasingly, I find myself not just doing those sort of full body shots on the street. I'm daring myself to get physically closer to my subjects because there's an immediacy and an impact that can happen with those shots that I think is really, really wonderful. And I think it's something that I encourage people to do, is that we often photograph people from a certain distance, like maybe 5 to 8 feet. And that may not necessarily be the best distance for a photograph. So once the person has said yes, don't hesitate to move in tight if you need to in order to make a better photograph. In that same courtyard, there were these kids that were there for the baptism, and I was actually focused on another man and child, where Neil, who was with me, pointed out these kids, and I just started framing them and making a series of shots. And you'll find that at events like this, in this case a baptism, but any sort of social gathering, there are a lot of cameras around, and this is probably one of the few times where I easily pick up a camera and start photographing children. Usually I'm very averse to just picking up a camera and just photographing children without necessarily asking the parents' permission first. But the overall vibe and the scene here was people were photographing each other pretty regularly, and the usual sort of social norms sort of kind of soften a little bit. So I got down and I started just making a series of images of these kids, just carefully trying to frame the three there. And I think I probably made 7, 8, maybe 9 shots. And it's only in this shot where this little girl leans against her mother, and that gesture really makes the shot for me. A couple of videos before, I talked about the importance of gesture, and for me, the gesture here is everything. Not only that of the little girl leaning against her mom, but the way the little boy in the middle is sort of scratching his face, and then the third boy is looking off to his right and holding this little, whatever it is. I think it's a little juice pack in his hand. And it was all about carefully observing not just the little girl, but observing everybody in the frame and trying to be as in control of the composition as I could be. It was a public, it's a public square in the middle of the church, this courtyard. So unlike the other shot, I really didn't have a lot of opportunity to sort of control where I was going to place these subjects and what I was going to include in the background. So it was largely dependent on me controlling my composition to eliminate as much of the distractions in the background as possible. Fortunately, I can't eliminate everything, so I just try to do the best that I can. And then by converting it to black and white and doing some selective dodging and burning, I'm able to control the viewer's experience of the photograph. Now here's another example. This was at a food fair in the Crenshaw district in Los Angeles. So the street was just filled with thousands and thousands of people. So I had even less control of where I could photograph someone. But I saw this guy and I saw him wearing this hat, and I knew I wanted to make a photograph of him. And when I walked up to him, I simply told him that, he reminded me of my grandfather, because he had a passing resemblance to my grandfather on my father's side. And I said, "Can I make your photograph?" And he said, "Sure." So I already was aware that the light from the late afternoon light was just going to be great on him. So I wasn't so much concerned with him. But I knew that I had a bunch of busyness in the background. So I forget what camera I was using. I don't have the data here, but I think I was using a fairly long telephoto lens, either an 85 millimeter equivalent. And so I used a fairly shallow depth of field in order to keep most of his face sharp, but it helped also to throw the background out of focus. If I had been using a wide angle lens or using a much deeper depth of field, the people in the background, the tents, all those other elements in there would start competing with the subject for the viewer's attention, which I don't want. It's one of the reasons I converted the image over to a black and white, was just because all the colors in the background were really big distractions. So for a lot of the images that you're going to see today, there is a lot of black and white, just because I often find that when I'm in a situation where I don't have a lot of control over the background or the setting, and there are a lot of color distractions, one of the easiest things for me to do is to simply convert it over to black and white. Now here's another crowded street scene, and I saw this guy, and he was on a mission to get somewhere, and I knew I wanted to photograph him. And the first thing that came to mind was to compliment him on his dog. I was really more interested in him as a character, but it was me using the excuse of complimenting and wanting to photograph his dog that allowed me to make this photograph. And it actually came together beautifully, because the contrast between this small white dog and this guy with his hair and these teeth and these glasses and these tattoos makes a wonderful, wonderful contrast. But as you can see, I'm in the middle of the street. It was at a street fair in the middle of downtown Pasadena. And this guy was only going to give me a couple of seconds. So I really had no control at all. But the one thing I did have control over is where the light was coming from. So this was late in the afternoon, and the light was behind me. So though this looks like it was illuminated using an artificial light like a strobe or a flash, this is all sunlight. And all I had asked him to do was face the sunlight, or face me, in order to make the photograph. By him wearing the sunglasses, it eliminated the whole issue of him squinting into the sun. But I love the way the quality of the sunlight illuminates his skin and just makes him very, very luminous. I was hyper conscious of what was behind him. I only had a chance to make several frames, and you'll see there are two figures that are immediately behind him, but there were a couple of other frames where there were other people walking past, which were a bigger distraction than him here, than these two people here. So would I have loved a cleaner, simpler background? Oh, absolutely. But there's some times where you just don't have any say on it. Now, he agreed to be photographed, but I don't think he would have agreed to have spent more time with me trying to look for an ideal background or anything like that. He was really busy to get going to where he was going. So I just took advantage of it. I lowered my camera position so I was about at his stomach level, because I wanted to make sure that his shoulder and his head and his hair had a really clean background. If I shot at eye level, then I would have included a lot more clutter in the background. And by just shifting my position down, I was able to eliminate a lot of that. This was up north near the Bay Area, and we were at this drag strip where all these people with their customized cars were racing. And I was kind of moving through here, and I saw this guy, and I knew I wanted to photograph him. And what easier way to ask a guy who's into cars to be photographed than to compliment him on his car. And the colors on this car are just crazy. The red and the yellow are awesome. But I knew I wanted to do more than just sort of a head and shoulders portrait of him. I wanted to create an image where there was a relationship between him and something he's obviously proud of, which is this car. So I remember with this one, I was using a Samsung NX30, and I probably had the kit lens on there, which is an 18 to 55. So I just used the wide angle capability of the lens here, and I included not only the car, but also the other vehicles in the background. So here, though I include a lot more elements in the frame, it helps to tell the story of where we are, which is a drag strip, that there are other cars, that there are other people, racers there. So in this case, I don't feel like all those elements in the background are distractions, but rather that they help to tell the story. And that's always something I'm trying to think about increasingly. For some portraits of strangers, I will try to make a really clean, simple background with no clutter. But more and more, I'm trying to create more environmental portraits where the elements behind the subject, in front of the subject, alongside the subject, help to tell the story of where we are and maybe who this person is. Here's another shot that I made as part of that trip to San Francisco. And I was walking on the beach and I spotted this guy, and I just thought he had a great face. And that's what I told him when I finally got up to him. I said, "Man, you got a great, great face. I love the way you look. Can I make your photograph?" And, at first he could come off as someone you might be a little bit intimidated by. But he just gave me this big smile, and he was very warm. And we ended up talking for about 15 or 20 minutes, and with him telling me his story and his background. And so it was a really overcast day that day. And I knew that though I could have included the beach here as part of the photograph, it was the face that really kind of drew my attention. So I was using an 85 millimeter lens on the Samsung NX300, and I just zoomed in really tight. And so I'm so glad I did, because that face, those eyes, they just tell a story there. Even though you have no idea about where we are, there's an immediacy and intimacy between me and him in the photograph that I hope that you experience when you take a look at the photograph. Whenever you're choosing to photograph a stranger, you don't have the leisure and the time that you typically have when you have somebody in the studio. So you're always having to sort of think about, okay, what do you want to emphasize about the subject? One of the things that I'm always considering when I'm approaching a stranger to make their photograph is, what's the light like and what's the background like? Because it's those two determining factors that make the biggest difference in a photograph. Too often, when people start making photographs of strangers, they're not being very conscious about what's happening in the background. And so that introduces a lot of clutter, a lot of distractions, and it really weakens the impact of the shot. And I really recommend that you really take ownership of that entire frame. This is a shot that I made years ago in Guadalajara, this guy who works on mufflers. And I had a tight shot of his face with the sunglasses, but I wasn't really completely satisfied with that. So I think this was made probably with an Olympus E3 or E1, and I had a zoom lens on there. And so I widened the zoom, so I included not only him, but also the mufflers and the tools in the background, because I felt that told a more complete story about who he was. There was a grittiness to this space, which I really, really liked. And actually, I was just walking by the store. I was just roaming around this small area in Guadalajara. Not a whole lot of people. It was just a small street, and I just saw this shop, and I just peeked my head in there, and I just walked in there, and I just asked them, what they do there. And luckily, I speak Spanish, so that helped me. But they were pretty agreeable to answering my questions, and then I just asked them if I could start making some photographs. And they were very cool with it. They were amused by the fact that, the stranger wanted to make photographs of their shop. They probably didn't see anything there that was very interesting to photograph, but for me, it was a really, really rich environment. And I really tried to make the most out of it. I spent about a half hour there. And sometimes if you find yourself in a situation which is so rich and they've said yes, it's important to be sensitive to not overstaying your welcome. But there's sometimes when people are just very cool about you sort of doing your thing, and as long as you're being respectful and you're being very conscious about, you know, their facial expressions and their body language, you can kind of tell whether or not you need to be there just for a few frames or whether you can extend your time in order to make a really good shot. Sometimes I make shots that are more typical street photography, where it's not so much about me approaching someone, but rather just making the snap. And this is one that I recently made in Hollywood. And I was in Hollywood near Highland and Hollywood Boulevard. And what I usually do here is I usually find the light. There's so much happening here with people moving around. They have these costumed characters that are posing with other people for tips. But it's at some point I was losing the light, and there wasn't anything particularly interesting for me other than this shaft of light that was coming from the west. So I just moved across the street, and I just kind of planted myself at a location where that shaft of light was, and I just allowed people to walk into the light, and I just started making frames. I loosely composed my composition, but then it was really about just as soon as someone's face was illuminated by the light, I would make the shot. And I don't know what affiliation these women are. They have the headdress of a particular type of religion or religious practice. I don't know exactly what it is, but they were together getting ready to cross the street, and I just kind of moved in there, and I had a fairly wide lens. I think it was like a 35 millimeter, and I just started moving. I just moved slightly. I mean, I was already planted there on the corner, so they were like basically moving towards and around me, and I just started making photographs. So since I was already there in that space, I think for the most part they just assumed that I was photographing anything but them. But unknown to most of the people that day, I was photographing them as they walked into the light. But because I was planted there and I already had the camera to my face, they weren't really concerned with me as a photograph. Some people have commented that they felt like she was sort of staring me down, but I don't remember her actually even acknowledging me at that moment. I kind of think that she was even looking past me. She has this kind of blank stare, so I don't think she was even conscious of the fact that the camera was being directed at her. And it's really the light in this case that really sort of illuminates her. And that stare really makes it stand out. Again, as you can see, it's a really busy street, a lot of stuff in the background. Don't have a lot of control, but by slightly shifting my position and doing some, selective dodging and burning in the background, I'm able to really emphasize her face and her expression in the shot. And lastly, there's this guy who was just down the street where the weightlifter was that I photographed, and my friend was talking to another person there, not making his photographs, and I started talking to him, and he was taking care of a pigeon that was unable to fly. He thought it had been injured or something like that, and we talked about it a bit, and I said, mind if I make some photographs of you while you smoke that cigarette? And he just laughed, and he said something along the lines, you want to take a picture of an old man smoking a cigarette? And he just laughed, and he didn't say yes or no. I just started making my photographs, and he just kept doing what he was doing. And like some of the other shots that I mentioned before, I got in close because there was something about that face that really spoke to me. Had I been further back and shot it with a wider angle lens, I would have included a bunch of other stuff in the background, including the signage here, which really would have been a distraction. I try to avoid including text and things like that in the background because people immediately are going to want to read it. I don't want that stuff in the frame, but I really couldn't do much. He was camped out on his stool or this box, smoking a cigarette, and I wasn't going to impose on him to move around to a different location. Sometimes I just sort of have to gauge how much someone's going to tolerate me in terms of me asking them to move, not to move, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. So I just decided, well, let me just get in nice and tight. And then I just made probably 10 or 12 different frames as he smoked a cigarette. And I thought this gesture of him just about to grasp the cigarette was really the best shot in the frame. I would have loved to have a little smoke coming out of his nose or his mouth, but that didn't happen. Could I have spent a little more time with him? Probably. But after about 10 or 12 frames, I felt like I was done. I felt I got this moment here, but sometimes I'm feeling I need to sort of push it a little more. I'm always trying to be very sensitive and conscious about not taking up too much of people's times. But one of the things that I try to remember, one of the things that I write about in the book is that most times when people have agreed to be photographed, they'll do whatever they need to in order to ensure that you make the best photograph of them as possible. And as long as you have an understanding, they have an understanding of that, it really helps. So in many cases, I'll tell people the light's better here, the background's better here. Could I move you over here? I'll make some small suggestions like, look over there and make the shot. I'm not conducting a full-blown studio shoot, so I'm not trying to ask too much of these people, but I'm trying to make the best photograph that I can in the limited time that I have. And one of the ways I'm going to be challenging myself is try to spend a little more time with people and photographing them for more. I make a lot of shots. I make about maybe 10 or 12 shots on average, but I'm going to see what can happen if I sort of extend it and go beyond that. One of the things that I can advise you about is just don't be satisfied with just making the one frame and walking away, because usually that one frame is going to be is barely going to be acceptable, because it's just that first shot usually doesn't do it. So it's really important to linger, interact with your subject, talk to them before and after you make your photograph, thank them. I know the big question is, do I get model releases? On these particular shoots recently, I don't get model releases, but I do have an app on my phone. And I also talk about that in the book about when and where and why you need model releases. But for these are largely personal photographs that I may end up using in a magazine article or something. So there really wasn't much of a need for a model release. I was just enjoying myself shooting and getting back into the practice of just going up to people and making their photographs. It's something that I have a lot of fun doing. So it's always a pleasure for me to get out there and just make photographs of people I don't know. And I still welcome people submitting images of strangers that they've made recently. And you can do so by just submitting to the Flickr pool and adding the tag hashtag TCF Strangers. Hashtag TCF Strangers. You'll see it there on the screen. And next week, I'll go through some of those images and I'll talk about some of the observations that I've made in terms of the photographs that you've submitted. But you have another week to do so, and please do that. And if you like what you're seeing here, please subscribe. I'm having a lot of fun doing these. And as I've said, I'm hoping to do some more, much more with the YouTube channel in the coming months. Starting next month, you'll probably see some real exciting content coming from here. And if this is the first time of you hearing about me and the Candid Frame, you should visit thecandidframe.com, where you'll find great conversations with some of the world's best emerging and established photographers. It's an interview show. It's all audio and runs about 45 minutes, and you can listen to it on your smartphone or smart device. There's an app that you can get for free, and you'll get the latest episode of the show downloaded immediately to your device as soon as it's available on Sunday. So thanks again for visiting us, and I'll see you next time.